I actually have a lot to say about trade deficits. Some of them are going to seem pretty obvious, and others are going to sound maybe kind of um, counterintuitive. So, when economists talk about trade deficits, they don't talk about them necessarily as bad things. Generally, when economists talk about trade deficits, they actually talk about it in terms of countries that have more wealth buying things from countries that have less wealth. That doesn't mean rich countries buying from poor countries, which does happen, but even amongst richer countries G10 or G20 or OECD countries, the countries with the higher GDP per capita are going to tend to buy more things from countries that have lower GDP per capita, even amongst those wealthier countries. So, if you talk about the United States running a trade deficit with Germany or with Japan or with Canada, right? Canada, Japan, Germany, these are all countries that are considered wealthy countries, and yet we run trade deficits with them. And there's a very, very simple reason for that, which is that the United States GDP per capita is $80,000, and Canada and Germany is about $50,000, right? So we're almost, twice as rich in GDP per capita terms, which obviously means that we're going to be buying more stuff from them than they're going to be buying from us because, right, GDP per capita is going to have an impact on prices. And in Japan, right, their GDP per capita is less than $40,000, right? I think it's like $33,000 or $34,000. When we're talking about China, right, their GDP per capita is less than $20,000, right? So these are all countries that the United States is going to be buying stuff from because we're significantly more wealthy than those countries, even though those countries are wealthy themselves, right? So running a trade deficit is actually considered the privilege of being a country that can afford things, right? So that's kind of one thing. Another way to think about it um, is that, right, trade deficits again are not a bad thing, right? I run a trade deficit with the grocery store. I run a trade deficit with Amazon. I run a trade deficit with pretty much any place that I buy stuff from. So how do I pay for that deficit? Well, because I'm running a surplus with my employer, right? So I run a surplus with my employer, right? I get paid money, and then I take that money and then I buy stuff, right? So and the other thing that we have to remember, right, is if you attempt to use tariffs to try to balance trade, you have this other more complicated problem, which is that if the United States all of a sudden decides to stop buying things from overseas, then that means that those countries that we were buying stuff from are no longer receiving dollars, and dollars are the number one reserve currency globally, right? So the problem is if the United States deprives the world of dollars, then that means that they're decreasing the supply of dollars, but there's still the same amount of demand for dollars, right? So by decreasing the supply of dollars without decreasing the demand for dollars, that then pushes up the value of the dollar, which then makes it easier, since the dollar is appreciating in value for people with dollars in the United States, to then buy stuff overseas, thereby undercutting the effectiveness of the tariffs, right? So unfortunately, people who think of tariffs as the way to balance trade is actually rather foolish. Um, it's basically a bunch of unserious people making serious decisions, right? If they were serious about making tariffs work, then you would have to do certain things like use capital controls. And capital controls haven't been used really to any degree in the United States since prior to the JFK administration in the 1960s, right? And there are ways that one can make tariffs work, The other problem is that you have firms that are going to benefit from these tariffs, but obviously unambiguously, consumers lose, and any producer that is going to need foreign inputs like rare earth metals or other inputs that we would be buying from these countries like Germany or China or Chile or Canada or whatever. And if they're going to have to pay for these inputs, then obviously they're going to have to be paying the tariff too, which then is going to make their cost of doing business significantly more expensive, which right is deleterious to them as well. Right, so there's all sorts of negative sides. Now the question then becomes: is this inflationary or deflationary? And that's really kind of more of a empirical question. Like we have to kind of wait and see, right? Because there are definitely the chances for it to be inflationary. But then if there's a whole lot of people being laid off, and then that leads to a recession, right, then that might actually lead to a decrease in demand, and then that would possibly have downward pressure on prices. Or if there's any inflation, the decrease in demand would kind of attenuate those inflationary pressures. So we're not really sure of the effect on price level. It's probably going to be inflationary, but we would have to see by how much, but definitely going to have an impact on the unemployment rate. And given the fact that the current administration doesn't like the welfare state or creating any type of safety net for these people who are going to then be unemployed, then that's an even more serious problem. Even worse in red states, where they have basically over the last 40 years kind of hollowed out the state level welfare state unemployment benefits. So kind of overall, it really makes no sense. I mean, the only possible argument that you could make about tariffs is that it's a bargaining chip to get countries to in Europe to pay more for NATO, but that still doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because I mean, if you start messing with your alliance partners, then they're just going to kind of find alliance partners elsewhere, right, and just decide to just kind of not deal with the United States at all, because the United States, right, is showing itself to be a very unreliable partner. So ultimately, kind of using that as a bargaining chip is cutting off our nose to spite our face. Right, and then there's some other issues as well, which is the difference between how tariffs are talked about and how the trade deficit is talked about, and the relationship between the trade deficit and tariffs. The administration on one hand says this is good policy and we should just have tariffs, and then 5 seconds later they talk about, like, but on the other hand, free trade is great and we really just want to have a better trade deal with these countries, so if we get what we want, then we'll just get rid of the tariffs. Well, hold on a second. Like, you can't have it both ways. If it's good economic policy in and of itself, then you don't ever get rid of the tariffs and you just keep them in place until you right, and that's just going to lead to outcomes that you like. Or if it's a bargaining chip, then as soon as you get what you want, right, you get rid of them, right? But the problem is they're arguing both things simultaneously, which also makes no sense. Again, clear evidence that this is right. Unserious people making very, very serious decisions that, of course, are not going to impact them, but is going to impact everybody else. I think this is probably the first historical case of a global superpower basically, right, kicking an own goal, right? The first global superpower, like, undoing its own superpower status. So as a political scientist, right, this is super interesting because this has never really happened before. Like, yeah, we're the most powerful country in the world, but we're going to kind of do some things that are going to undo that. It's idiotic. Um, and then when you talk about, right, Health and Human Services basically undoing all of the programs that study viruses and science and things like that. Probably, you know, the next pandemic that happens in the next 10 or 20 years will probably all be obliterated by ourselves. And the rest of the world's just gonna kind of go on, and the United States will show itself to be just a blip in human history. So, yeah, good stuff.